Silence doesn't make an avoidant forget you. It does something far more unsettling than that. It removes the emotional noise they were hiding behind, the text, the explanations, the reassurance, the familiar emotional access that allowed them to feel in control without fully committing. When that noise disappears, there's a pause. And in that pause, something they've spent a lifetime avoiding begins to surface. What replaces the noise isn't peace, it's uncomfortable clarity. For an avoidant, silence isn't empty, it's loud. It forces them to sit with their own nervous system without using you as an emotional regulator. When you are present, even during conflict, they could externalize their discomfort. They could label you as too much, too emotional, or demanding instead of confronting their own internal tension. Your silence removes that option. There's no one to push against, no one to blame, no emotional stimulus to distract them from what's actually happening inside. At first, they feel relief. Space has always felt like safety to an avoidant, but that relief is short-lived because silence doesn't just create distance, it removes certainty. They can no longer check if you're still available, still attached, still emotionally orbiting them, and that loss of certainty creates a subtle but powerful shift. The control they thought they had starts to erode, not through confrontation, but through absence. As the days pass, their ego tries to fill the gaps. They tell themselves, you've moved on, that they're fine, that this is what they wanted. But the mind can only suppress emotional reality for so long. Without fresh conflict or reassurance, memory becomes selective. The intensity fades first. What lingers are moments of safety, warmth, and familiarity, the parts of the connection that didn't require vulnerability from them, but still provided comfort. This is when silence becomes a mirror. They begin to notice the absence, not as freedom, but as something missing. They may not label it as loss yet. Avoidance rarely do at first. Instead, it shows up as restlessness, distraction, or a quiet urge to check in on you without reaching out. They replay old conversations. They wonder why you haven't tried to reconnect, not because they're suddenly ready to commit, but because your silence disrupts the story they told themselves about being the one who needed space. What makes this clarity uncomfortable is that it isn't dramatic, it's subtle. It doesn't scream, it lingers. It asks questions they can't easily answer. Questions like, why does this feel different than I expected? Or why do I feel unsettled if I'm the one who pulled away? And the longer the silence holds, the harder it becomes to escape those questions. This is why breaking silence too early weakens its impact. The moment you re-enter emotionally, you restore their ability to regulate through distance again. True silence isn't about manipulation or waiting for a reaction. It's about stepping out of the dynamic entirely. When you stop managing their comfort, you create space for something they can't avoid forever. Awareness. And for an avoidant, awareness is the beginning of everything they once ran from. Silence affects an avoidant in a way most people don't expect, because avoidants are not triggered by emotional intensity the way anxious partners are. Begging, explaining long messages, or emotional outpouring doesn't create longing for them. It creates relief. It confirms the dynamic they're comfortable, you reaching them distancing. Emotional texts give them something to push against, something to label as pressure, and something that allows them to stay emotionally disengaged while still feeling wanted. In other words, your effort actually stabilizes their avoidance. What disrupts an avoidant isn't emotion, it's absence without pursuit, silence without explanation. When you stop reaching, stop clarifying, and stop offering emotional access, the entire structure they relied on quietly collapses. There's no reassurance coming in, no emotional availability to lean on, no familiar signal that says, I'm still here if you need me. And that removal creates a psychological vacuum they don't know how to fill. Avoidants often regulate their nervous system externally. They feel safe, not because they're emotionally settled, but because they know they can create distance whenever discomfort arises. Your presence, even when strained, gives them a buffer. They can deactivate, withdraw, or go quiet themselves, knowing you'll eventually reappear with explanations, softness, or concern. Silence removes that safety net. They no longer have the ability to regulate through your availability. This is where things start to feel different internally. Without your emotional energy absorbing the tension, Their nervous system has to manage itself. For an avoidant, this is deeply uncomfortable. Self-regulation requires emotional awareness, something they've spent years learning to bypass. Instead of naming feelings, they distract. Instead of processing loss, they minimize it. Silence interrupts those habits. There's nothing to respond to, nothing to suppress, and no one to project discomfort onto. At first, they may not consciously register what's happening. It shows up subtly: difficulty focusing, a low-level unease, or an urge to stay busy. But beneath that restlessness is a loss of emotional scaffolding. The system they depended on to stay detached no longer exists. And without it, that avoidant can't immediately return to equilibrium. This is why silence doesn't provoke dramatic reactions from avoidance. You won't see pleading or emotional confessions right away. What happens instead is internal destabilization. They begin to feel slightly off, slightly unsettled without a clear reason why. And because avoidants are uncomfortable with emotional ambiguity, that feeling lingers longer than they Silence also removes the narrative they use to justify distance. Without your messages, there's no pressure to point to, no emotional demand to blame. The question quietly shifts from why are they doing this to why does this feel harder than it should? That question doesn't demand an immediate answer, but it plants awareness. And for an avoidant, awareness is far more threatening than emotion itself. This is why silence hits avoidance differently. It doesn't chase them. It doesn't confront them. It simply steps out of the role they unconsciously relied on. And when that role disappears, they are left to face something they've spent a lifetime avoiding: their own emotional regulation, without you doing it for them. For an avoidant, control has very little to do with dominance and everything to do with emotional certainty. As long as they can sense that you're still available, still reachable, still emotionally responsive, they feel regulated. Even if they're distant, even if they're unsure, the option of you remains open in the background. Silence removes that option quietly, without accusation or confrontation, and that's why it's so destabilizing. When you go quiet, they lose the ability to check on you. Not overtly, not by asking how you feel, but through subtle cues. A message reply, a story view, a reaction, a familiar pattern that confirms you're still emotionally accessible. These micro confirmations are how avoidants reassure themselves without committing. They don't need closeness. They need certainty without vulnerability. Silence takes that away. Without those signals, the story they told themselves begins to crack. They can no longer assume you're waiting. They can't casually place you in the mental category of still there if I want to return. And because avoidants rely on emotional distance to feel safe, losing that certainty creates tension rather than freedom. The control they believed they had was never about choosing you later. It was about knowing they could. This shift happens without drama. There's no argument, no emotional showdown, no final conversation that allows them to regain footing. Silence doesn't announce itself. It simply removes access. And because it doesn't provoke a defensive response, the avoidant can't easily dismiss it as pressure or manipulation. There's nothing to push against, nothing to explain away. Control slips quietly, and that's what makes it effective. At first, they feel relief. The absence of emotional demand feels familiar. But relief depends on predictability, and silence disrupts that. As time passes, relief turns into uncertainty. Curiosity begins to creep in, not about reconciliation, but about your inner world. Are you moving on? Did something shift? Why aren't you reaching? These questions arise because the dynamic has changed, not because they suddenly want intimacy. Avoidants are highly sensitive to changes in emotional patterns, even when they appear detached. When the pattern breaks, their nervous system notices. They may not consciously acknowledge it, but internally, they're recalibrating. The lack of access creates an information gap, and the mind tries to fill it. Curiosity replaces relief because uncertainty feels more threatening than distance. This is also where their sense of power becomes challenged. They didn't lose control because you demanded it. They lost it because you stopped offering reassurance. And that distinction matters. Power shifts when you no longer participate in maintaining their comfort. You're no longer confirming their assumptions or stabilizing their emotional landscape. What makes this moment so impactful is that it's self-generated. You didn't confront them. You didn't explain your boundaries. You simply removed yourself from the role of emotional availability. And in doing so, you changed the dynamic without asking permission. Silence removes their false sense of control because it reveals the truth their security was never self-contained. It depended on your presence. When that presence disappears, curiosity emerges, not as desire, but as a need to understand what changed. And once curiosity replaces relief, the emotional balance has already shifted. Avoidants rely on emotional distance, not because they lack feelings, but because distance gives them a sense of safety. It allows them to stay regulated without having to fully engage with vulnerability, uncertainty, or loss. As long as there's a predictable emotional gap, you reaching them, pulling back, the dynamic feels familiar and controlled. Your silence disrupts that balance by removing the reference point they unconsciously depended on. When you go quiet, there's no longer a clear emotional position for them to orient around. They can't tell where you stand, what you feel, or how invested you still are. And for an avoidant, that absence of information is deeply unsettling. They are used to defining themselves in contrast to someone else's emotional availability. Silence erases that contrast. There's no signal to respond to, no emotional pressure to resist, and no reassurance to quietly absorb. This is where the ego steps in to fill the gaps. The avoidant mind doesn't immediately interpret silence as loss, it interprets it as a disruption in the narrative. The ego starts asking questions, not out of longing, but out of self-protection. Did I miscalculate? Did I underestimate their independence? Why aren't they reaching the way they always do? These questions aren't emotional admissions, they're attempts to regain psychological footing. Silence becomes a mirror because it reflects something they didn't want to see, that the dynamic may not have revolved around them as much as they assumed. Avoidants often maintain a quiet sense of superiority through detachment. Distance gives them the illusion of control and desirability. Your silence challenges that illusion. It suggests that you may not be waiting, not chasing, and not defining your emotional state around them anymore. What makes this mirror uncomfortable is that it doesn't accuse or demand. There's no message to dismiss, no tone to critique, no emotion to minimize. Silence simply exists, and in that stillness, the ego has nothing external to react to, so it turns inward. That inward turn is rare for avoidance, and it's precisely why silence is so effective. As time passes, the ego's questions become more pointed. They replay past interactions, not to feel closeness, but to reassess their own assumptions. Were they as detached as they thought? Did they rely more on your availability than they admitted? These thoughts don't always reach conscious awareness, but they influence behavior. Restlessness increases, distraction loses its effectiveness. The mind circles back to the same unresolved uncertainty. Silence also removes their ability to frame the breakup or distance in a way that protects their identity. Without your continued effort, they can't easily tell themselves that you were the one who wanted more or needed too much. The narrative shifts subtly. If you're not reaching, not protesting, and not seeking validation, the story becomes harder to sustain. This is why silence feels like a mirror they didn't ask for. It reflects not your absence, but their reliance on emotional distance as a source of safety and control. And when that reflection lingers long enough, it creates a quiet reckoning. The ego doesn't collapse all at once, it adjusts, questions, and recalibrates. But once those questions begin, the dynamic has already changed. For avoidance, memory doesn't work the way it does for emotionally expressive partners. When they are in closeness, their nervous system is often activated by perceived pressure, expectation, or loss of autonomy. In that state, their mind prioritizes threat over connection. They remember what felt overwhelming, what felt intrusive, what justified pulling away. But when emotional stimulation is removed, when there are no messages, no conversations, no tension to react to, the nervous system finally begins to settle. And when it settles, memory reorganizes. Without ongoing emotional input, the conflicts fade first. Arguments lose their emotional charge. The sharp edges of disagreements soften. What once felt urgent becomes distant. This isn't because avoidance suddenly reinterpret the past romantically, but because their body is no longer in a defensive state. Distance allows their nervous system to downshift, and when that happens, the mind is no longer scanning for reasons to stay detached. As the intensity fades, something else begins to surface. Moments of safety, warmth, and familiarity. These memories don't rush in all at once. They appear gradually, often in quiet moments when distraction stops working. A shared laugh, a calm conversation, the feeling of being understood without having to explain everything. These were never absent before. They were simply overshadowed by the discomfort of closeness. Avoidants tend to remember feelings after distance, not during connection. During closeness, their awareness is consumed by what might be expected of them emotionally. After distance, those expectations dissolve, and only the emotional residue remains. This is why avoidants often feel lost later than others, not because they care less, but because their emotional access is delayed. Your silence creates the conditions for this shift. Without new interactions to reinforce old patterns, the mind fills the space with what feels safest to recall. The absence of emotional stimulation gives memory permission to reorganize around comfort rather than threat. This is when idealization can begin, not as fantasy, but as selective recall shaped by emotional regulation. Idealization doesn't mean they forget the problems. It means the problems no longer dominate the narrative. The mind starts to ask different questions. Was it really that bad? Did I overreact? Why do the good moments feel clearer now? These questions don't always lead to action, but they change the internal landscape. The story they told themselves to justify distance loses some of its emotional weight. This process is subtle and deeply internal. Avoidants rarely announce it. They may appear unchanged on the surface, still distant, still reserved. But internally, the emotional balance has shifted. The absence of conflict creates space for appreciation. The lack of pressure allows warmth to reemerge. Silence is powerful here because it doesn't interfere. Reaching out too soon interrupts this natural recalibration. It reintroduces stimulation, reactivates defenses, and brings the focus back to what felt overwhelming. True silence allows memory to settle on its own terms. This is why your absence can feel more present than your efforts ever did. It gives their nervous system time to remember the connection without having to defend against it. And in that quiet space, idealization doesn't feel forced, it feels earned. When silence stretches on, avoidants rarely respond in obvious or direct ways. They don't rush to text, they don't call to clarify feelings, and they almost never admit uncertainty openly. Instead, their response happens quietly, in the background, where they can maintain emotional distance while still gathering information. This is where monitoring begins. Avoidants are observers by nature. Before they move toward anything emotionally risky, they need to feel oriented. Your silence removes their access to reassurance, so they look for it indirectly. They rewatch your stories, not necessarily to see what you're doing, but to feel where you stand. Your tone, your energy, your absence or presence, all of it becomes data. They're not trying to reconnect yet. They're trying to understand. They may reread old messages, especially ones that felt safe or affirming, not the emotionally charged conversations, but the neutral or warm exchanges that didn't demand vulnerability from them. These messages help regulate uncertainty. They remind the avoidant of who you were in the dynamic without forcing them to engage in it again. It's a way of feeling close without being exposed. Checking mutual spaces serves a similar purpose, whether it's shared social circles, online platforms, or familiar environments. These checks allow them to stay connected from a distance. They want to know if you're moving on, changing, or emotionally unavailable in a way that contradicts their assumptions. And because silence doesn't provide answers, they seek them wherever they can without risking rejection or pressure. This quiet monitoring isn't about manipulation or control. It's about safety. Avoidants approach uncertainty the same way they approach intimacy, cautiously, indirectly, and on their own terms. Observation gives them a sense of orientation without commitment. It allows them to assess risk before deciding whether any form of contact feels tolerable. What's important to understand is that this phase often precedes any outward movement. Avoidants don't act until they feel internally regulated enough to do so. Monitoring helps them stabilize their emotions while preserving distance. It's a transitional space between detachment and potential re-engagement. Your silence plays a critical role here. Because you're not reaching out, the dynamic remains undefined. That ambiguity keeps their attention engaged. If you were to reappear emotionally, their need to observe would disappear, replaced by relief or withdrawal. Silence sustains curiosity without triggering defenses. This is also why avoidance may seem unaffected while being deeply attentive. On the surface, there's no contact, but internally, your presence hasn't disappeared. It's shifted from interaction to observation, and that shift matters because it signals a change in how they relate to you. Avoidants observe before they approach because observation feels safe. It allows them to stay in control while slowly acclimating to the idea of emotional movement. And whether they ever reach out or not, this quiet monitoring indicates that the silence has disrupted the old dynamic. You're no longer actively available. You're an unknown. And for an avoidant, the unknown is far more compelling than emotional pursuit. Silence does more than create distance. It quietly challenges an avoidant's sense of identity. When you're no longer emotionally available, no longer reachable, no longer playing the role you once did, an unspoken question begins to form, not out loud, not consciously at first, but persistently. Who am I without their availability? Avoidants often build parts of their identity around independence, self-sufficiency, and emotional autonomy, but that independence is rarely absolute. It's supported by knowing that connection exists at a safe distance. Your availability, even when unused, functioned as an emotional anchor. When that anchor disappears, the avoidant isn't just missing a person, they're missing a stabilizing reference point. This is where internal friction begins. Silence forces them to hold two opposing experiences at once. On one side, there's relief. The absence of emotional demand feels familiar, even comforting. No expectations, no conversations to navigate, no vulnerability required. But on the other side, something unexpected emerges. Emptiness. Not dramatic grief, but a quiet lack. A subtle awareness that something once present is no longer there. Loss and freedom start competing internally. Freedom says, "This is what I wanted." Loss whispers, "Then why does this feel off?" Avoidants are especially sensitive to this kind of contradiction because they rely on clear emotional narratives to stay regulated. Silence disrupts those narratives. It creates ambiguity where certainty once lived. What makes this moment so destabilizing is that it isn't about missing you in a romantic sense, at least not yet. It's about missing the version of themselves that existed in relation to you. The one who had someone emotionally available in the background, the one who could pull away without consequence. When that dynamic disappears, the avoidant is left confronting a version of themselves they didn't prepare for. Avoidants feel loss late because they delay emotional processing, while others feel the impact immediately. Avoidants often suppress it in favor of stability. They distract, they rationalize, they focus on external structure, but loss doesn't disappear just because it's postponed. It accumulates quietly beneath the surface until it has enough space to be felt. Silence provides that space. Without new interactions to override the internal experience, the emotional weight begins to register. It shows up in moments of stillness, late at night, during routine activities, or in unexpected emotional dips. The realization isn't dramatic, but it's deep. The absence is no longer abstract, it's personal. This is also when avoidance becomes harder to maintain. The internal friction demands resolution. They can't fully lean into relief without acknowledging emptiness. They can't claim freedom without noticing loss. And because avoidants struggle with emotional integration, this tension can linger longer than they expect. Your silence doesn't force answers, it forces awareness. And awareness is what eventually brings loss into focus. Avoidance may not express it outwardly, but when they finally feel it, they feel it deeply. Not because they've changed suddenly, but because the silence gave them no place left to hide. Breaking silence too early is one of the most common ways this entire shift collapses. Not because silence is a tactic that needs perfect timing, but because premature contact restores the very dynamic that allowed the avoidant to stay emotionally distant in the first place. The moment you reach out before the internal process has unfolded, you reset their comfort. When you initiate contact too soon, you unknowingly signal availability again. That signal tells the avoidance nervous system nothing has really changed. The uncertainty they were beginning to feel dissolves. The questions soften. The curiosity fades. They no longer need to self-regulate or sit with ambiguity because emotional access has been restored. Comfort returns. And with it, emotional distance. Reaching out early also gives the avoidant a familiar role to step back into. They can respond minimally. They can delay. They can be polite but detached. These behaviors aren't signs of cruelty, they're signs of regulation. Your message gives them something to manage instead of something to feel. And once they're managing, they're no longer processing. Silence only creates impact when it's unannounced. Announced silence still keeps the dynamic alive. It invites interpretation, anticipation, and control. An avoidant can emotionally prepare for it, frame it as temporary, or reassure themselves that you'll return. Unannounced silence removes that preparation. It introduces uncertainty without explanation, which is what disrupts emotional patterns. It also needs to be self-focused. Silence driven by waiting, watching, or hoping for a reaction is still emotional engagement. Even if you're not speaking, you're orienting your inner world around their response. Avoidants are highly sensitive to emotional undercurrents. When silence is fueled by expectation, it subtly maintains the bond. True silence redirects energy inward. It's about reclaiming your attention, not managing their behavior. Emotional neutrality is what keeps silence from turning into pressure. Anger, resentment, or silent protest still carry emotional charge. That charge can be felt, even without words, and it often triggers defensiveness rather than reflection. Neutral silence, on the other hand, doesn't demand interpretation. It simply exists. And that lack of demand is what makes it powerful. Silence loses its effect the moment it becomes bait. If it's used to provoke, punish, or extract reassurance, it backfires. Avoidance can sense when silence is performative. It feels like another form of pressure, and pressure reactivates their avoidance. The internal process shuts down, replaced by emotional withdrawal or justification. Real silence isn't strategic, it's aligned. It's the natural outcome of stepping out of a dynamic that no longer serves you. When you're no longer trying to be understood, chosen, or validated, silence becomes effortless. And that effortlessness is what allows the avoidance internal world to shift without resistance. Power doesn't come from withholding communication. It comes from no longer needing it to regulate your own emotions. And when silence reflects that inner shift, it no longer feels like a move. It feels like absence. And absence, when authentic, is what creates the deepest impact. Internally, avoidants go through a subtle but powerful shift that rarely gets expressed outwardly. On the surface, they may appear detached, calm, and unaffected, telling themselves and anyone who asks that they needed space or that everything is fine. But silence has a way of disturbing that internal narrative. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the mind begins to ask a different question. Why do I feel unsettled? The certainty that once buffered their egos starts to waver, and the internal story they relied on begins to crack. This moment is crucial because it marks the beginning of real self-reflection, something avoidants typically resist. Their ego, which thrives on rationalizing detachment and maintaining emotional distance, begins to weaken. The patterns they use to justify their behavior, I needed freedom, they were too much, I couldn't handle it, lose their grip. Silence has removed the external stimuli they relied on to feel in control, leaving them with only their own internal assessment. And that assessment doesn't always align with the story they've been telling themselves. As the ego weakens, curiosity begins to grow. Not the kind of curiosity that demands contact or resolution, but a quiet, unsettling attention to the things they've been ignoring. Memories of warmth, comfort, and connection start to surface. They begin replaying interactions not to criticize or avoid, but to understand them. The small gestures they once overlooked, the subtle ways you showed care, the safety they felt in your presence, all of it becomes clearer. Memories softens the edges of past conflicts, allowing the positive aspects to stand out. This selective recall is powerful because it doesn't rely on interaction, it happens internally without manipulation, and it shapes how they perceive the relationship in retrospect. It's in this internal recalibration that reconnection becomes possible. The avoidant is no longer just defending against emotional discomfort. They're beginning to process the absence in a way that can lead to consideration, reflection, and eventual approach. But it's important to note possibility does not equal certainty. Avoidance may notice, feel unsettled, and even idealize without ever taking action. Reconnection only occurs if their curiosity meets a situation in which they feel safe enough to engage. The shift also changes how they relate to themselves. Silence forces them to confront the reality that their previous strategies, detachment, distraction, avoidance, may not have been as satisfying or complete as they thought. They start questioning their internal patterns and the role they played in the dynamic. This is a quiet internal awakening that rarely manifests outwardly until enough time has passed. Ultimately, this moment is the subtle turning point that silence creates. On the outside, everything may look the same, but inside, the avoidant is wrestling with clarity they didn't ask for and feelings they didn't anticipate. The ego softens, curiosity grows, and memory shifts. And within that quiet internal shift lies the potential for reconnection. It's not guaranteed, but it's the opening that only true silence can create. Silence isn't a tactic. It's the moment you stop managing their comfort. And that's when an avoidant finally has to manage their own.